Today in the Catholic Mass series, we explore the different forms of the traditional Latin Mass. What distinguishes a Low Mass from a Solemn High Mass, or a Missa Cantata from a Pontifical Mass? We'll unpack each form, including their structure, ministers, music, and historical development. We also look at the unique character of the Requiem Mass and the theological reasons behind its distinctive rituals. Whether public or private, sung or silent, every form of the Mass expresses the same mystery, the sacrifice of Calvary made present. Join us as we rediscover the beauty and the meaning behind the immemorial Roman Rite. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. And please consider leaving a rating and a review on the podcast. This will make sure that more people can find these episodes and discover the beauty and the truth of traditional Catholicism. So now let's join Father Michael Goldaddy for episode 35. Do you know all the forms of the Latin Mass? Father Goldaddy, it is good to have you back again, and hope your week is going well. And today we're talking about the different kinds of the Mass, right?
Yes, week is going very well, thank you. We have minor orders and subdiaconate in a few days, and then of course the great ceremonies of Holy Week.
Yeah.
So maybe this podcast is timely.
It is.
Because I'll be able to explain some forms of the ceremony that faithful generally cannot see, especially the Pontifical Mass, which we have the blessing to have here at the seminary quite often. But we also want to talk about other forms of the Mass, which maybe on some occasion they can see with the Solemn High Mass. Certainly they'll see the Low Mass on a regular basis, and the High Mass, or what's also called the Missa Cantata. So just wanted to talk about each one of those. Also to say a few words at the end about funeral masses, Requiem Masses.
Okay.
And then maybe one last question to answer, because I will refer to the Pontifical Mass as the normal, even though we don't see it that much, but certainly the ideal of the Mass, from which everything is a reduction.
Right.
But that idea, that ideal, certainly changes with the Novus Ordo.
Yeah.
And so just want to give some attention to that question.
Okay. So you're not going to be speaking about things like the Children's Mass or the extraordinary form and ordinary form?
No, unfortunately. Unfortunately. Okay. I'm not your man for that.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's, I guess, start with the Pontifical Mass, because, obviously well, I shouldn't say obviously, but the Low Mass that probably most of our faithful are very familiar with, it is, like you said, a reduction from the Pontifical Mass. So in order to understand the Low Mass, we need to start with the Pontifical Mass, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, again, that may sound very surprising, because many people, or at least rarely, see the Pontifical Mass. But we could call it the prime analogate, the prime model, from which the other forms of the Mass are reduced, both in its history, because that was the Mass, the ideal, and it's the Mass that's described to us by Apostolic Fathers, by the older documents of the Church, but it's also symbolically the ideal of the Mass. You have there sort of this correlation with the structure of the Church. You have the bishop surrounded by his clergy in their orders, offering up the sacrifice. It really is the symbol of the hierarchical Church, offering up to God the eternal sacrifice. Again, maybe just a little history here. In the early Church, broadly speaking, there wasn't always, and certainly in the Roman Rite, not always and everywhere, Mass said daily. It was certainly always said on Sunday, and whenever the bishop desired it, and certainly for the dead. And maybe because of this, the Mass of the pre-sanctified, which we only have once in the Roman Rite now. I think it's more common in the Eastern Rite, but basically the communion ceremony that we have on Good Friday, maybe it makes more sense in view of this when you don't have Mass celebrated every day. So there's that element, and that was more or less practiced up until about the early Middle Ages. No, I'm sorry if I'm revisiting some material that you've already seen in this podcast, but it's interesting for the question.
Yeah.
So you have the bishop representing Christ. The whole church is represented around him in pontifical form, and the solemn High Mass, Low Mass, all reductions for practical and good reasons from the Pontifical Mass. You don't always have bishops. You don't always have the ministers. You don't always have the cantors. But again, from the earliest documents, St. Clement of Rome, Pope St. Clement, to the Corinthians, the letter of St. Ignatius, writings of St. Justin Martyr, refer to the high priest, it means the bishop, the priest, the Levites, who we can understand to be deacons around the altar. Mm. So with that being said, let's describe the solemn Pontifical Mass. So you do have a low form, a low Pontifical Mass. I'll just say a few words about that afterwards as well. And I think one of the first things that will strike the eye of the faithful is the extra furniture of the Pontifical Mass near the altar, because of course the bishop will have his throne or fald stool. So the throne is the permanent seat of the bishop. The fald stool is by its nature the portable seat of the bishop. It has this appearance almost of a folding chair. Mm. And the throne is meant to be for those who are in their diocese, for the bishop who is in his diocese. The fald stool was meant to be for one celebrating in a place where he didn't have that jurisdiction or the right to the throne. Now these days, and certainly for us in the society, it's rare to see a Mass at the fald stool. I'm not sure that we even do it anymore. I remember formerly we did, maybe as a way to show that our bishops don't have jurisdiction. But it was common enough anyways for visiting bishops to use the throne with the permission of the ordinary. And it's good to for us to conserve these ceremonies at the throne. So there's really nothing to prevent us from using the throne, and we do. So
okay.
So the bishop will come to the throne, and especially during the first part of the Mass of the catechumens, where much is done by deacon, subdeacon, schola, the bishop will stay at the throne, and he will be with his assistants. And again, this is another thing that will catch the eye are the number of assistants on the altar for the bishop during the solemn pontifical ceremonies, because he ordinarily has an assistant priest. He will have 2 assistant deacons. So these are in addition to the deacon and subdeacon of the Mass.
Okay.
He'll have a group of 4 ministers, servers called capellani. So I'll describe them in a second. Maybe we can just go through those
Sure.
those ministers which are with him at the throne. So the assistant priest, it's usually the highest ranking prelate in the community. So here at the seminary, I'm the rector. I would normally be the assistant priest for our pontifical ceremonies, and he's close to the bishop in some respects, closest to the bishop. So he'll handle the book for the bishop when the bishop's going to sing. He will handle the ring of the bishop when the bishop's going to wash his hands. And then throughout the Mass, he's right next to the bishop almost all the time,
Okay.
just assisting him at the book. And I suppose there's a further practical role that he plays. Not that the bishop's going to make any mistakes, but if he does, the assistant priest is right there,
Okay.
watching him all the time.
So it's kind of a similar role to what we would see in a sung Mass or a high Mass with the MC.
Yes. Yeah. He's sort of maybe in some respects a personal MC of the bishop.
Okay.
Yeah. He doesn't look to all the other servers like the MC does, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then the assistant deacons. So 2 additional deacons, and again, these would be honorary roles to assist the bishop at the throne, not at the altar. Rarely will they go up to the altar, but they flank the bishop from the sacristy up to the throne, and then back to the altar as well, showing him honor again. This is something which is common enough even outside of the, let's say, the bishop celebrating. Oftentimes, for example, in ordinations, bishops who are in attendance but not the official celebrant of the ordinations, they will be flanked by 2 dignitaries as well.
Okay.
And then they assist a bishop at the throne. So Assistant Deacon 1, we call him AD1. AD1 will take care of the mitre, put it on, take it off. The Assistant Deacon 2 will open and close the missal. So they have very specific jobs there. And then the capellani. So this refers to the mitre bearer, the crozier bearer. So those that bear what we call the insignia of the bishop, so the signs of his episcopal office, and they'll be identified by those wearing copes. And the mitre bearer and the crozier bearer also have an additional humeral veil with which they handle the insignia. Of course, the mitre and the crozier are specific to the bishop, signs of his position. And there have been various symbols, maybe imposed, if not derived from these insignia. So the mitre representing the teaching role of the bishop. He has these 2 pieces that come up, of course, on the front and in the back of the mitre. So one symbolism of that was tongues of fire, or also 2 testaments. And then in the back, he has 2 bands that hang down from the mitre. Again, another symbolism could be the double commandment of love. And the bishop wears the mitre whenever he's blessing, whenever he's processing, being incensed, hands washed at the lavabos, and pretty much any time he's sitting, most times that he's sitting.
Okay.
And then the crozier, of course, it has the appearance of a shepherd's crook, and indeed it represents his shepherding, his jurisdiction. And he uses it for the processions and while preaching. Book and bugia. The bugia is the candlestick with candle that always accompanies the book on the right of the book. And guess we could say that this represents the bishop who brings teaching, who brings wisdom, moral direction to the faithful.
Okay.
And then, of course, there are the other ministers of the Mass, the deacon, subdeacon. The cross-bearer, oftentimes, when you can do it, is also a subdeacon as well. And then the lesser ministers, which we can talk about then when we come to the Solemn High Mass. So, but these are the things particular to the pontifical form of the Mass.
Okay. So the bishop is going to be celebrating the Mass itself, but similar to, again, most of our faithful are probably at least somewhat familiar with the Solemn High Mass or the Solemn Sung Mass, with the deacon and the subdeacon. Similarly, you're going to have the deacon and subdeacon chanting the gospel and the epistle. They're going to be doing things like getting the altar prepared. In fact, I don't even think the bishop approaches the altar until the offertory. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean, well, he goes up to the altar to preach, but sure. He doesn't approach the altar for the action of the Mass until he's starting the offertory. In fact, the offertory really begins at the throne, and then he goes.
It's true.
Yeah.
Okay. So interesting. So that is the main, I guess, thing that we would see as distinct or different, at least visually. That's again different. You're going to have different positions. You're going to have and a whole lot more people. If you are in a smaller parish, you may not be able to fit the whole pontifical ceremony inside the sanctuary.
This is true. This is true. I mean, they do their best,
right? And
some bishops will adapt,
sure,
and adapt the number of servers even, because of course they go to parishes every so often for confirmations, and the parish tries to accommodate as they can these ceremonies.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Pontifical Low Mass, what is distinct about that? That's, again, where a bishop is celebrating Low Mass, non-sung, right?
Yes, it's when he's celebrating Low Mass of pontifical rite. So not every Low Mass that the bishop's going to say is going to be pontifical as such. These are special solemnities that are added to the Low Mass. And this is very, very rarely seen by the faithful in the parishes. I would say it's even rarely seen by us. Every once in a while, we'll ask the bishop if he can do a pontifical Low Mass at the altar. Part of it is because throughout the Mass, he's flanked by two chaplains. So those chaplains are either going to be priests or they can be deacons, because they do some functions which are proper to sacred orders. But another thing, and I think if people check our live feed, the history of our live feed from the seminary, they might be able to find a pontifical Low Mass.
Okay.
But the bishop's going to start in choir. So he's just sitting there. Normally, the Low Mass would be after the office being sung in choir. And in cathedrals, places where the whole office is sung, oftentimes the main Mass would be called the conventual Mass, and maybe the pontifical Mass would take place after terce. So the bishop's already in choir, and his vestments are set up on the altar itself, so in the middle of the altar. And so after the office is finished, the chaplains would come to him, reverence him. He would come to the altar, and then they would bring the vestments down from the altar and help him vest at the foot of the altar as well. And actually, as in all pontifical ceremonies, one thing, it's one of those just many little details that people are going to be missing if they're not looking for it. The bishop doesn't put on the maniple right away in his Mass. He always waits till after the Confiteor for the Indulgentiam. So he celebrates Low Mass with the solemnity of two chaplains. One chaplain holds the bugia and stands by the book, removes the bishop's ring. Second chaplain responsible for the chalice. He also removes the bishop's skull cap or zucchetto. All right, so it assists in that way, and then you have two acolytes as usual in addition. So
okay, and you would see the bugia, the little candle that would be on the altar for a pontifical low mass as well, right?
that would, yes, yeah, follow the book around.
Interesting.
And then he unvests at the altar as well, and goes back to the choir stall. Doesn't go to the sacristy.
So, I guess the development of the Pontifical Low Mass is just a simplification of the Pontifical High Mass, right?
Yes, as with everything, it's really the spirit of the Church to preserve, as much splendor of the ceremony as it can, and so that's why you'll see all these variations, and even though today these forms of Mass are rather structured and codified, you'll still see, especially with the Missa Cantata, some variation. Sometimes they can't use incense, and that's fine if they can't. But they're still trying to incorporate elements of solemnity.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess let's move on down the chain then to a Solemn High Mass, or is it ever called a Solemn Sung Mass? I said that earlier. Is that a thing? Or did I just make that up?
Solemn Sung Mass. I suppose you could. You may have made that up. It probably is called that, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, but Solemn High Mass. So this is where we're, again, faithful, probably more familiar with this than the other two that we've spoken about. This is a priest, a deacon, and a subdeacon. In a lot of places, it's usually just the three priests. So at some of our priories, it's usually three priests, three ordained ministers, but it can be a deacon and a subdeacon.
It can, yes, absolutely. And we have that privilege here to have all three distinct orders at the same time. It's interesting to see, maybe a little history again, the use of the deacon rather heavily throughout the history of the Church. Again, going back to older documents, even though the bishop is the prelate and offering the Mass, many of the lesser functions would be accomplished by the deacon. And I would say maybe in the early Church, he had a bigger role. It's been reduced a little bit. I remember reading about litanies of intercession that he would lead in the midst of the Mass. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, he still does sacred functions there at the altar. As a side note, we have in residence with us a Dominican, Father Albert, who's a professor now at the seminary. And there's a particular Dominican rite, which looks a little different when it comes to the low Mass. It looks very different when it comes to the Solemn High Mass. We've done one of those here. And the deacon and subdeacon really had to relearn how to say it. And the deacon's role is, actually both roles are very large.
Interesting.
And in fact, there's no MC. There's no MC. He's kicked off the altar in the Dominican rite.
That's funny.
Yes. And then the subdeacon, it's also a position that's been there in the history of the Church as well. It's not a divine right like the diaconate is. It's not a sacrament like the diaconate is, but ecclesiastical institution, which, let's say, shares in some of the duties of the deacon, assists the deacon, hence the name.
Okay.
The deacon can never be replaced by a lesser cleric, but for good reason, a subdeacon can be replaced by a lesser cleric. Has to be cleric. We call this informally the straw subdeacon, but it's a cleric. Again, good reason. What would be a good reason? Maybe a pontifical ceremony, and a deacon or subdeacon is not available for that position. Another cleric could do that.
Okay.
Can't do all the things that a subdeacon would be able to do in terms of handling the chalice, purifying the chalice, but other things he can. So,
okay.
So for the Solemn High Mass, what would catch the eye? Of course, you generally have 6 candles burning at the altar. The the chalice is set up on the side on the credence table with a humor veil which covers it, and of course that humor veil will cover the subdeacon later on in the offertory and most of the canon of the Mass. And then, well, you can't have a Solemn High Mass without chant and incense. So those two things are a must. And maybe lesser ministers at the altar than a Pontifical Mass gives more attention to the servers. Maybe we could say a few words about the servers.
Okay.
The MC, of course, takes a prominent role. Now, I would say a general rule for servers is they should try not to distract from the action of the Mass. In liturgical books, or the official rubrics of the Mass, there's little mention of anything of the MC. His position is not absolutely fixed. He's there just to make sure that the ceremonies go smoothly, make sure everyone does their part. And then, at a solemn Mass, he'll be at the missal, he'll be at the altar if one of the ministers is occupied with something else. For example, he has to get the book for the epistle and to give that reverently to the subdeacon. The deacon will replace him at the missal, and then MC comes back. There are moments where the deacon and subdeacon are not near the missal during the canon. The MC will step in to do that. So it's actually more flexible of a position than it seems. Mm-hmm. Of course, you have the thurifer, and because he's handling something, there's all sorts of little rubrics and customs depending on, let's say, the liturgist that you are following. Of course, in America, the name of Fortescue is an authority. Here at the seminary, we've inherited rubrics from a French liturgist at the French college where Archbishop Lefebvre went. Sterky, his last name. And then there was another liturgist, Hagee, that Archbishop speaks about. So many of our rubrics for these positions will come from that source. So sometimes in the district, there are conflicts over what seminarians do versus what the local chapels do. But that's why.
And there's all kinds of jabs and jokes about French liturgists, which
course.
Is fine. We can leave those for another day.
Yes, a separate podcast.
All right, fair enough.
And then, so for the thurifer, depending on whether he has incense in the thurible or not, it may determine whether he holds it in his left hand or the right hand. And depending on who he is incensing, and their rank on the altar or their rank in choir will determine how many swings from the thurifer that they get. One note is that, of course, the thurifers love to swing the thurible at the altar, but some of the rubrists would like to see them stand, stationary, keep the thurible stationary, so as not to have useless motion distracting from the sacrifice.
Yeah. I remember one time I was... maybe I shouldn't admit this. One time back in St. Mary's, I was serving Vespers and Benediction, and there's thurifer for that as well. And our pastor at the time, I just wanted to see how many swings I could do before he stopped me. I think I got to 7 before he was like, Andrew, stop it.
Wow.
I probably shouldn't admit that, but
wow, you.
We do like to swing the thurible around a lot.
We do.
It's a thing.
That's one more than a bishop. He gets 3 doubles, so
Yeah.
6 swings.
Yeah. Hence why he was probably annoyed.
Right.
Yeah.
Then, of course, you have the acolytes. They do what acolytes do. And actually, their position varies less from the Pontifical to the Solemn High to the High Mass. They take care of the cruets. They bring things, transfer things to and from the altar. You usually have a cross bearer, not always, but usually have a cross bearer as well, subdeacon or not. And then torchbearers as well, just to add to the solemnity of the sacrifice. They're not essential, and oftentimes in the simple Missa Cantata, they're not there. But again, torchbearers in the numbers of 2, 4, 6. I have even seen 8.
Mm-hmm.
It can get too much sometimes, but
yeah.
So yeah, that's the Solemn High.
I don't think we've talked about this in this series in terms of the history of the cross and processing in with the cross. Is it correct? I've seen this or heard this, I think, in a few different places, that in old times that there was not always a crucifix stationary on the altar, that the crossbearer would come in and place the cross behind the altar.
I think you could be, you're right. You could be right there. I've certainly seen that, in more makeshift situations.
Sure.
But
and I'm not suggesting we should go back to that.
No.
That's some liturgical archaeology, but
right. And in fact, the liturgical law now would demand a cross there on the altar already.
Right.
So.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the Solemn High Mass. In the notes that you gave me ahead of time, Father, I see the next point that you wanted to talk about was the Low Mass. We're not going to go to the High Mass or the Sung Mass yet.
Right.
Okay.
There's a reason for this order.
Okay.
When we get to the High Mass, it stems from a comment that Father Fortescue, so the same famous Father Adrian Fortescue, makes, which we'll come to. So
okay.
Yeah, Low Mass next, and maybe a little history there. So. Again, during the early centuries, Pontifical Mass, and I would say even Solemn Mass, because the bishop's not always available, is the norm, with deacon and subdeacon. But when not possible, bit by bit, the Mass would include, whatever elements of solemnity were available at the discretion of the celebrant. And so, a very important modification, which happens, we say naturally over time, is the development of the Low Mass. Now it's greater simplicity would make one think that it is the original form, but of course it's not. It's a later abridgment. So Father Fortescue, I'm going to take some material from him at this point. He says that from the beginning, we always hear of the Holy Liturgy celebrated with deacons, assistants, in the presence of people who cry out and later sing their part. So the Low Mass is a substitute when the celebrant does all the actions of the other ministers who are not available. And by the early Middle Ages, it became common for each priest to celebrate their own separate Mass. I read somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, and it makes sense. It's probably part of the development of the theology of the Mass. So the Mass, in its application of merits, fruits, is limited. So more Masses, more spiritual benefit to the priests and the faithful.
Yeah. I remember reading probably something similar, and I think it may have been in Fortescue. I've got them on my bookshelf there, but
it probably is. Yeah,
it was a development of less of a emphasis on, as time went on, less of a emphasis on community and unity, and more of an emphasis on the theological reality that Masses are worth infinite So why not say them as often as you can? And then we get the development of the private Mass.
Right, exactly. And in fact, it develops so much that, holy, devout priests who love the Mass started to say more and more every day. And it's even said that one of the popes, Pope Leo, so this would be the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century, was saying up to 9 Masses a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, a few centuries later, that was forbidden.
Right.
So the priest was no longer allowed to say more than 1 Mass a day, except on Christmas and All Souls Day, and again with special permission, Sundays when he has to binate, or say even sometimes three Masses. So, so the low Mass became very common. I don't want to call it the norm. It sounds like, we've gone from Pontifical Mass as the ideal to low Mass as ideal. That's not the case. This is simply a practical measure that was taken. But it was so common, clearly, that by the time of the Council of Trent, well, after the Council of Trent, with the Missal of Pius V, you have the main rubrics of the Mass, what in the Missal is called the Ritus Servandus, having rubrics just for the low Mass, and then sort of an addendum for Solemn Mass. But then to the low Mass itself, of course, we don't need to say much about this. It's what the faithful in general see more commonly. But you have 2 candles at the altar. Now, a bishop can have 4 candles, and that's outside of the pontifical low Mass.
Okay.
No incensations, no incense. The priest does what all the other ministers would do. He has his acolytes, of course, because he doesn't leave the altar once he ascends it. Yep, a great simplification there. Now, again, can we add things to the low Mass? I would say legitimately yes, and certainly that's the practice. Maybe in many of our schools, for the school low Mass, adding some singing at the offertory or communion, or processional, recessional, and yeah. So we can do things like that within reason.
Or sometimes there's a homily added or something like that, but again, that's not really changing the structure of the low Mass. Exactly.
I want to make a note here, okay. Because of course many of the faithful prefer the low Mass over the high Mass or the more solemn forms of Mass. And there's an interesting observation from Dr. Kwasniewski, and I didn't copy down the source, the book or the article from which it came. It may have come from his book, Close the Workshop. But in any case, he gives 3 reasons why this can be.
Okay.
So one of them is a cultural impatience with ritual. Westerners and maybe especially Americans often prefer efficiency, and part of efficiency is brevity over long religious ceremonies. There's also another reason he gives is a lack of musical education. That makes sense. You have the elaborate singing moments in the Mass, like the gradual, the Alleluia, and it feels tedious to some. But we have to look at things objectively, of course. And then he says a third reason, which is very interesting, a desire for silence and solitude in a noisy, fast-paced world. And of course, the quiet of the low Mass, gives people that necessary moment of silent reflection, silent contemplation, which is understandable. But that being said, there is the principle of the splendor of the liturgy, which is for the glory of God.
Mhm.
And of course, nothing resembles the glory of God like the pontifical ceremony. And we could say, I think it's Father Gear, in fact, that makes the point that it follows from this that the more solemn forms of the Mass are celebrated with greater value and greater efficacy than merely a low Mass, which makes sense. Of course, there's a limited amount of value of fruit that comes from the Mass, but there's some accidental, so to speak, increase from these added elements of solemnity.
Sure.
So
it is it is interesting. I this is a discussion that you hear often. People saying, "Well, I prefer the low Mass because I prefer the quiet, or I prefer this XYZ." And again, I'm not trying to call anyone out, but I think we'd have to be honest with ourselves, myself included. If I say I like the low Mass, why am I saying that? Is it because I think I have got other stuff to do on Sunday and I want to get done, or on a weekday or whatever? Like, we just have to be honest about what it is that we like about it and don't. And that's okay. That's the first step, is admitting we have a problem. No, I'm joking. But
well, you're right. And then also, okay, if something seems too inaccessible or rarefied in the High Mass, well, appreciate the spirit of the Church, and the Church upholds it as an ideal. Okay, what is it about it? What it's about it that I don't understand or appreciate, and then educate myself on that.
Right, exactly, and that's going to help immensely with understanding more about the liturgy in general, and that's going to deepen your experience of the low Mass as well. Not that it's all about your experience, but yeah,
no, absolutely.
So does the sung Mass, the Missa Cantata, does that come then from the low Mass? Is that a later derivation of the low Mass? Sort of, maybe?
Yes, without disparaging in any way the sung Mass, of course. It seems like an attempt to bring back solemnity and splendor to the low Mass, with a few extra servers, with chants, in most cases with incense. And this is where I bring in Father Fortescue. He calls it a compromise of a compromise. The low Mass being the first compromise, the Missa Cantata being the second one. But again, without any disparagement to it, because of course these added elements of solemnity are an excellent thing, are a good thing. So
yeah. I think it's all about just remembering that there is a norm, there is a standard, and that is the Pontifical sung Mass, the Pontifical High Mass, and then later on the Solemn High Mass. As long as we understand that, then that's fine.
Right, exactly. Maybe a few words now about the funeral Mass or the Requiem Mass.
Sure.
It's an interesting question to ask if we have the Mass, and the Mass is sufficient as it is, for not just the glory of God, the benefit to the church militants, but also to the church suffering. Why do we need a special ritual for it? Well, we could say, generally speaking, a Mass which is said for a special intention, like a Requiem Mass or a votive Mass, has a greater impetratory value. So petitioning God for the specific thing, in this case, of course, the eternal rest of a soul or of souls, with a special Mass. And so that's why this whole rite, ritual for the dead has developed with some rubrical changes. So it'd be interesting to go through that. Again, I think for the faithful, there's going to be many things that they just don't catch unless they're following the missal and reading the rubrics. But in the Requiem Mass, we generally see some elements of, what would be associated with the public celebration of the Mass. The funeral and then the requiem has a aspect of private mass because it'd be said for the dying and their family and those closely associated with it. So things like the creed are never used in the requiem. In the solemn form, the kiss of peace and the prayer for peace, which comes right before it, are not said because this is something which is shared with others. Of course, the signs of joy, of festivity, are taken out of the Requiem Mass. You never have the Gloria the Gloria in Excelsis, the Gloria Patri as well at the prayers for the altar. The lavabo is omitted. There's never an Alleluia. And then some ceremonies which would be directed towards the living are omitted from the Mass for the Dead. So, for example, the blessing of the water at the offertory, because of course the water represents the faithful. That's omitted before the priest puts a drop in the chalice. The blessing at the end, the blessing of the congregation at the end, is omitted. In the solemn form, the blessing of subdeacon before epistle, deacon before the gospel, that's omitted. So all these blessings for the living are omitted, and
even the incense too, I think, right? Now I don't remember. Shoot, I might have stumped both of us.
In the High Mass, the incense is omitted altogether up into the offertory, and then at the offertory, I'm pretty sure the incense is blessed.
Okay.
Goodness, you're catching me here. I'm working out.
I got 10 more minutes. Let's go.
Okay.
No, just kidding. It's interesting. One question I do have about that, and I'm not trying to stump you, honestly. There's an honest question.
I should know that I do this regularly.
I should. No, I'm joking. For those who are horrified that I'm giving Father a hard time, we've known each other a long time. Sorry. The altar boys do not kiss anything. They don't kiss the cruets, and if the priest is wearing a beretta, they don't kiss his hand when giving the beretta.
Right. Yeah.
During a funeral mass, is that the same sort of thing? It's
same principle. Okay. Respect for the living. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because all those things are respects for the celebrant. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
And then, of course, when they go back to the sacristy, normally the servers would get their own blessing by the priest, and that's omitted as well.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yep. And altar boys often think sometimes, I must have done a terrible job. Father didn't give me a blessing. Nope, you did fine.
Exactly. And then for the funeral mass, you have the absolution at the end of the mass. So normally the body would be brought to the church maybe the evening before, the morning before the funeral mass, and then at the end of the mass, even if it's a low mass, the cross would come out and be at the head of the coffin, and depending, of course, whether it's a lay person or a cleric, will determine where the head is. So for the laity, the head is away from the altar, and then the priest will bless the coffin, use holy water, incensation, so on and so forth, and then they make procession to the cemetery itself. So, but many are very familiar with those ceremonies.
Sure.
Because even in very small situations, we try to solemnize that a little bit, at least have the incense and holy water. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Grab a fourth grader and give him the thurible.
Yep.
He'll be overjoyed.
Exactly.
Oh, that's good. So we've talked a lot about the traditional Mass, and we haven't talked, obviously the whole series is about the traditional Mass, but the new Mass, in times that I've gone, sometimes it seems like that there's singing, sometimes not, sometimes. Are there these derivations or separations between different forms of the new Mass?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, what we can say, and this is not speculation, this comes right from the mouth of the architect of the new Mass, is that the ideal of the Mass is definitely not the Pontifical Mass.
Okay.
It's, if we can speak of the norm anymore, it's definitely a more basic form, and any kind of extra solemnity is just seen as aesthetic frill and unnecessary. So, yeah, going to the source, Bunini wrote the Reform of the Liturgy, and he asked this question. He answers this question. He says the point of departure for the Reform, so his Reform, should not be the private Mass. So it's not that we want to have the private Mass, but rather the Mass with congregation. And he emphasizes this over and over again, the importance of the congregation. But which Mass with song? Because he says there should be congregation singing. So what form of the Mass singing? Should it be the Pontifical? Should it be the Solemn? Should it be the simple sung Mass? And he says, given the concrete situation in the churches, the answer can only be Mass celebrated by a priest with a reader, servants, a choir or cantor, and a congregation. Right? All other forms, and these are his exact words, all other forms such as Pontifical Mass, Solemn Mass, Mass with a deacon, will be amplifications or further simplifications of this basic Mass. So whereas, we had spoken about in the traditional Mass, everything else is a reduction, right? Mm-hmm. A simplification of the Pontifical. For him, everything more solemn than what he's described will be an amplification. Mm-hmm. But again, you get the sense it's unnecessary. Mm. Archbishop Lefebvre, he gave a conference in Montreal in 1982, and he says that when he was Superior of the Holy Ghost Fathers, he was in Rome and invited with other heads of congregations to hear directly from Bunini what this new Mass was, because everyone was mystified. And I'm trying to find Archbishop Lefebvre's own words here.
That would have been a fascinating fly on the wall moment to be a part of. Goodness.
Yeah, no, exactly. So here he says that Father Bunini, with much confidence, explained what the normative Mass would be. This will be changed, that will be changed. We will put in place another offertory. We'll be able to reduce the communion prayers. We'll be able to have several different formats for the beginning of Mass. We'll be able to say the Mass in the vernacular tongue. We look at one another, saying to ourselves, we looked at one another, that is to say, those that were in attendance at this meeting and listening to Father Bunini and saying to each other, it's not possible. Archbishop says, personally, I was myself so stunned that I remained mute, although I generally speak freely when it's a question of opposing those with whom I'm not in agreement. I could not utter a word. And then some of the others did make objection, had questions. One of them asked, is this an active participation that is bodily participation, that is to say with vocal prayers, or is it a spiritual participation? You've spoken so much about the participation of the faithful. And I guess this was a Benedictine that was asking that. And he said, we Benedictines celebrate our Masses without the assistance of the faithful. Does this mean that we must discontinue our private Masses since we do not have faithful to participate in them? And Bunini's response was, to speak truthfully, we didn't think of that, which is hard to believe. Anyway, and then, another question. Yes, you're talking about suppressing this and suppressing that. It sounds like this new Mass could be said in 10 or 12 minutes, at most quarter of an hour, and that's not reasonable. That's not respectful towards the the solemn act of the church, and Bernini's response, we can always add something. So that's the mentality. We have this basic form of Mass in which the faithful are almost essential, basically, because there's this emphasis on the priesthood of the faithful and meal as well. You need someone at the other side of the table. Mm-hmm. And so everything else, whatever solemnizes the Mass and gives greater glory to God, that's just for, old dinosaur aesthetics.
Yeah.
Who want incense and bells. So.
I was just going to say, you can almost hear Father Bernini saying, oh, you want the smells and bells? Okay, fine. We'll add the smells and bells. Like it's an afterthought. It's wild.
But it makes sense now why the current churchmen look at the traditional Mass the way they do. So
yeah, it's just a bunch of frivolity. You don't need it. Just go back to the normative Mass.
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah.
So
that's wild. Well, Father Goldaddy, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a joy to chat with you.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
You too.